All right. So thank you so much for coming in. I have to say, these conversations have become almost a highlight of I guess, a bi-weekly highlight for me. I really enjoy these. This started from me just wanting to talk to more people about logistics technology. It's so fun to get these general perspectives. And we've had like a pretty good run so far. We started off, our first webinar was with Eric Johnson from Journal of Commerce. We moved on to the Chief Digital Officer at Hapag-Lloyd and then at Agility. And one of those words, the buzzwords that consistently pops up when you start talking about technology and where things are going is platforms, right? Everything is a platform. The platform economy is taking over the world. And one of the most important names in that platform economy has to be Alibaba, right? It's just one of the largest B2B organizations out there, B2B platform. I just knew that we needed to get Jamin on to talk a little bit about how Alibaba views logistics innovation. Same ground rules as previous webinars. If you joined the other ones, please feel free to drop questions in the chat, either in the chat or in Q&A. Be very happy to field them as we go along. One other thing that I'm throwing in here, I know that we tend to be a passionate crew when it comes to logistics technology. One of my favorite Freightos t-shirts is Get Ship Done. If you hear anything interesting during the course of this webinar, put it up on LinkedIn, tag Freightos. I'll send out a couple of t-shirts to some of the more interesting tidbits that people end up sharing. Again, just throw in a tidbit of something interesting that you pick up in this webinar, tag Freightos in the LinkedIn post, and we'll be in touch with you afterwards to send you your t-shirt. So with that, Jamin, if you want to turn your video and audio on, great to see you.
Hey, I think I can't start my video. I think it's asking you to
sorry.
do it.
Let me see if I can get you in there.
There we go.
Perfect.
Hey, everyone. Cool.
Awesome.
Can you hear and see me? Give me a thumbs up.
Yeah, we're good to go. Perfect.
Great.
Thank you.
Good to meet everybody. It's a pleasure being here. Ethan and Judah, appreciate the invite. Yeah, I'm Jamin Dick. I lead North America supply chain for Alibaba. And we're responsible for everything that moves in and out of the US. So it's always good to talk with other industry leaders and exchange ideas. So we're very happy to be here today.
Awesome, and we're thrilled to have you here. I had the privilege of hearing Jamin talk a little bit about Alibaba and how they view logistics technology, and particularly the role of small businesses, which is something that tends to be neglected a little bit in logistics conferences, I think. So I walked away from that. I heard him speak at a Freightos event in Barcelona, kind of before COVID shut down real trade shows and real events. So I know that he has some really interesting things to say. Again, I'm Eitan or Ethan Buckman. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at the Freightos Group. And just, again, a quick orientation of why we really like talking about this stuff so much. Freightos runs two platforms, actually. One called WebCargo that connects airlines and ocean liners to logistics providers. And the other one, Freightos.com, that connects freight forwarders to shippers. And of course, you may have heard, Freightos is also partnering up with Alibaba.com to run Alibaba.com Freight, which is a joint marketplace to help Alibaba.com buyers import their goods easily to the United States. So with that, I do want to jump directly into kind of what we started talking about, which is the SMBs and particularly the SBs, right? The really small businesses that tend to not import a ton. U.S. Department of Trade data shows that while 97% of U.S. importers are small or mid-sized businesses, the remaining 3% import about 60% of all U.S. imports. So it's very much a heavy head. But the data that we've kind of collected internally shows that really small shippers, companies that are only shipping single digit, maybe low double digit times per year, are still responsible for about 13% of imports in the EU and the US. This is like a really sizable segment. And one thing that we've seen in e-commerce and COVID recently is this rise of e-commerce, the rise of small empowered businesses. And I kind of want to start off our conversation there, Jamin. This is definitely Alibaba.com's sweet spot, right? Working with companies, possibly some larger companies, but many, many smaller businesses as well. What role do you see these smaller importers playing in global logistics? And especially when it comes to freight, what kind of services and qualities do they really value?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. I think the first way that it impacts logistics is average load sizes. So if you're moving away from, I'd say if there's more of a long tail and smaller companies who are enabled to easily trade internationally, what that's going to do is make load sizes smaller. And so that means services like LCL and smaller freight air shipments are going to expand. And this drives some complexity, I think, for providers and freight forwarders and customs brokers, everybody in the value chain. So I think there's an impact there, and the industry needs to figure out how to adapt to that. I also think there's going to be a shift towards offering clearer costs and delivery times up front. People are going to have to figure out, how do I convey certainty up front before the shipments leave, because smaller businesses are, by nature, a little bit less sophisticated. And so they're really going to gravitate, I think, towards services that provide them with certainty up front. So DDP and things like that.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think that's an interesting, definitely that certainty is something that really resonates. One thing, speaking to a lot of logistics providers, a certain part of their investment when working with a new company, right? It costs X amount of money to onboard a new company, whether it's a very large importer or a very small importer. And in the past, they've compensated when working with smaller companies by charging a little bit more. So, right, if somebody's doing 50 shipments or one shipment, you basically pay the same to onboard them. Maybe you can increase your revenue or your margin a little bit for the people that are doing one or two shipments. Do you feel like the ability to charge the smaller businesses more is disappearing? Or conversely, do you feel like logistics providers as a whole are getting better at scaling their services so that it's easier for them to onboard smaller companies?
Yeah, it's a great question. I actually think it's a bit of a mix. There's no clear one right answer, but I do think that I'm starting to see a lot of providers who are figuring out, hey, we can lower our costs to work with these customers if we figure out easier ways to onboard them. We'll talk about platforms like Alibaba and others, and Freightos. But I think there's pressure to participate in this market. And what that means is we have to push the cost of onboarding and just engaging with these customers down. And some of it, yeah, but there's also, I think there's probably a little bit less price sensitivity with the smaller guys, because they're figuring out how to do a complex thing, which is to bring in a container of goods from China, which is inherently a little bit complex. And so there is, if we can make it easier for them, I think that's where the real opportunity is.
Mm-hmm. I guess speaking of that, reducing the barrier to working with vendors, working with buyers, do you think there's any lessons that logistics providers can learn from, I guess, the typical factory that sells on Alibaba.com, right? The factories that are offering services to those same types of buyers? Do you feel like there's any lessons or kind of processes that those types of factories would work that the logistics providers could learn to help scale the way they provide service as well?
Yeah, I think that, again, I go back to what's the job that's being done by this buyer. So the buyer's main job isn't logistics in many cases. It's to find the right product to run their business. And so, successful Chinese sellers recognize that, and they're trying to map, trying to produce the right product and then make it easy for them to bring it into the US or wherever they're shipping into. And so I think the lesson is really the same for logistics providers. Logistics and shipping and things like that are really a means to help them get the job done that they are trying to do, which is to supply their business. And so the more that we can get out of the way with the complexity and work tightly with the trading platform or with the original supplier, then that makes it much easier. It makes it actually stickier. The less visible that we are as logistics providers, it's actually a good thing to a seller or to a buyer in the U.S.
Yeah, that was something that, even at Freightos, it took us a really long time, I think, to actually implement that idea that these companies don't really want a logistics provider. If you're working with a small importer or exporter, you are at best a means to an end, and they just kind of want all of it to disappear. Even when you talk, and this is one of the reasons why I think so many people underestimate the size of this market, is a large freight forwarder will identify importers as a target audience. But the small businesses that typically import 1 to 10 times a year, they would never self-identify as an importer. They identify as a retailer or an e-commerce seller, and you need to speak to them in those languages. So I absolutely agree with that. And I think that actually moves into a pretty good transition where, I kind of only put the logos here to force myself to make sure that I knew them all. But, you've had, over the course of your career before Alibaba, you've worked at a number of companies that all kind of focused on the role of supply chain and innovation, from Target, Pitney Bowes, Borderfree, and OpenSky, of course, which was acquired by Alibaba. And I'm curious if there's any individual theme that you see across what you've seen at all those companies about how supply chain is evolving, what are the global trade barriers that have dropped, and what has very, very clearly not dropped yet but needs to.
Yeah. I think what's the main change that's happened for international trade is a lot better services around auto classification and providing duty and tax quotes up front. So it was not that long ago where you had to have a team of human beings who were doing classification. Still, some of that's required, but we are getting better in the industry about machine-driven classification at high levels of accuracy. So I think that's a barrier that has been lowered. And then that allows us in turn to in the e-commerce world to provide duty and tax quotes up front and more certainty to buyers. So I do think that's really important. The second thing is probably around seamless exchange of trade and logistics data and documents. Go back 10 years ago, and it was pretty rudimentary. And it a lot of innovation has happened in the last few years to make that more seamless. More tracking with actionable messaging on various platforms rather than just. I think 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you would find out that your container left a week later than planned or is stuck in customs. Which is really challenging for a small business. I think some of those things have really gotten better over the last few years.
Yeah, and this actually came up in our previous conversation with Biju from Agility, who was talking about the role of standardization around those messages. And I think that becomes such a core aspect, especially when working with these smaller importers that don't really want to get involved with the in-depth messages. They want actionable messages that matter to them. If you tell them that something is held up at customs, that doesn't matter unless they actually know how to deal with it at customs. Have you feel like if you had to look at the biggest barrier right now that's still stopping importers, is there one thing that really sticks out?
Well, I mean, you mentioned standardization. I think that's still a big barrier. So, I mean, that is the key that I see for the future to get better. One of the biggest challenges, despite automation, is the underlying processes still reflect an era of manual paperwork and human workflow. So even when we digitize something, a bill of lading, it ends up in a stack on somebody's desk at some port. So simply automating the endpoints, I don't think is enough. If the electronic documents end up getting printed out and processed manually. So, I think recreating these processes is a pretty huge project that involves cooperation across technology and the industry and government. So there's not an obvious person who can stand up and say, I own this. It's really collaboration. And I think that's the biggest challenge to get us out of a system that was really designed for 20 years ago or 50 years ago, which was all human.
Yeah,
driven.
That's so interesting. I actually heard this on a podcast on the way into work today, which was basically trying to explain what the difference is between an API and the way that APIs interact with different platforms. They said fundamentally an API is software talking to software rather than a human talking to a human or human talking to software like a GUI. And I think what you're really pointing out here is that if you're just using an API to mimic the movement of a bill of lading, where there's still a human who's sending it and a human who's collecting it, then you really haven't done much besides digitizing a process and making it marginally faster, but not really making it scalable. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting point.
I mean, and just sorry to just
no, for sure.
append that. I mean, I think one of the I think there's a false or a myth that when, like you say, when you digitize something, it's just magically going to get easier, and it's only easier if it reduces errors and reduces time. So like the biggest problem in supply chain is it said one thing on the trade document, says another thing on the clearance information, so there's a lot of, we have to reduce that. We have to eliminate any difference in data from end to end. And I think that's the key challenge here.
Mm-hmm. Which is just a pen what you appended there. I think I was recently speaking to somebody who was talking to me about the process of working with different logistics providers in Southeast Asia, and how you'll typically have stacked logistics providers with a tier 3 working with a tier 2, and that provider working with a larger provider. And when you have an international shipment with 6 or 7 providers that are involved, and that's not even getting into the carrier at the last mile, being able to standardize that in one format is really important. I see Jordan is asking a question here in the chat. Jamin, do you have any thoughts on what are the technologies being used for real-time track and trace and seamless exchange of documentation? Have you come across anything that really stands out?
That's a great question. I mean, I don't have anything handy. It really depends on the mode of transport, I think. I'd say U.S. ground transportation is much more developed than ocean. And so I think people like Freightos and Flexport, and there's many others out there who are innovating. Sorry, Ethan. I got to mention the others too.
It's all good. We love it all. We love it all.
But the point is that there's innovation is happening in those areas. But I don't know about specific technologies underneath that. I think what we're seeing is it works best when it's integrated into the booking and then the full life cycle of the of transportation. If the tracking is rich and actionable in those platforms, then it's exactly what a buyer needs.
Right. And I see Louise has broached the magic term of how do you see blockchain evolving to resolve delays? Do you feel that blockchain has a major role to play here? I
do. So blockchain is one of those things that's part hype and part reality. Just like any new technology, I don't think we want to pin our hopes completely on it, but there are use cases that clearly would benefit from blockchain. And so I do think as standards start to emerge in blockchain and technologies that look like they could work across various platforms, payment platforms, logistics, really that's the key bridge, right? It has to be the trading platform, the payment platform, and the logistics platform have to be using the same underlying, maybe it's a hyperledger or some kind of technology like IBM's or TradeLens, I think it's called. Mm-hmm. So, there are, I think, promising developments there, but I think we're still a ways away from industry standard. China is still doing one thing, whereas the rest of the world's doing something a little bit different.
Right. And I think that actually is a very, very good transition to kind of this next general area of question, because really for standard to take, you need somebody to throw their weight behind it. And I think most importantly, you need the demand side to throw their weight behind it. You need, right, the person who has the buying power is the person who can ultimately dictate where standards come from. So, it's one thing if Target says every vendor we work with needs to use it. I think there's a really cool role for platforms that aggregate so many buyers like Alibaba, where you're actually coming in with the aggregated strength of so many buyers to push. So I think that's really interesting. When I talk to companies, I spend a lot of time speaking to people that aren't in logistics, and part of my job is to get them excited about it. And what I've always said is, you look at the largest tech companies in the world, you look at Alibaba, you look at Amazon, these are all companies that are built on these three-legged pillars of e-commerce, data, and logistics. right? There's no question about it that being able to collect all those things together is such a force multiplier. And Alibaba has done it, right? Like I think in spades, you just really every couple of weeks you see how much movement Alibaba is making in the logistics space. I'm curious, like, what are the factors that you take into account, or that Alibaba takes into account as an organization when deciding where to move in on supply chain issues? Like, how do you prioritize across the entire supply chain where Alibaba should get involved?
Yeah, that's a good question. For us, in the end, everything comes back to what our customers need. So, which, maybe that's a little too simple of an answer, but that really is true. I mean, we start there and try to work backwards to how can we serve them best. So our goal is to make it easy for small businesses around the world to do business with anyone else in the world. So when we think about what it takes to make it easier for U.S. SMBs to do business anywhere, we think about providing them with the best air service, the best ocean, the best land customs clearance services. And that's in other countries, clearing customs is a bigger problem than the air freight service, right? So then our priority in that region would be to help those customers in that area clear customs in a compliant way that's especially difficult. So, we're building services that are sort of tailored, and I think of it, sort of like Lego blocks. When they all come together, then they're sort of configured for the specific region. And so, I think what guides us most is like I say, customer need, and asking the question, is Alibaba in a better position to help with that need than everyone else? And can we add value to their business that way? So that's really how we think about it, and I think everything is put through that lens.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that Alibaba has a different take on buyer needs than what most logistics providers out there have right now? Like, are you seeing things from a different perspective, possibly, than larger freight forwarders?
Well, I do, because our perspective is ultimately a buyer is trying to, like I mentioned before, they're trying to source goods for their business. They're trying to run a business, right? Mm-hmm. And so enabling payments and logistics and warehousing and inspections and everything like that is just a means to that end. And so I'm the guy who looks at supply chain things. So, I have to remain humble about it. Like, my stuff is an enabler for that thing. It's not the end goal. Like, having a shipping number of containers isn't necessarily the goal. The goal is for our buyers to be successful in their business. So what we're trying to do is look at the end-to-end transaction. And the advantage here is being able to see the Chinese factory, being able to see the trade data, being able to connect that to logistics. So that's what's important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and from a logistics provider, or from a company that's also involved in logistics movement, I guess there's something that, as you say, is very humbling, where there's no real win. Like, a win when it comes to logistics is that everything worked fine. So kind of your upside is hitting what the customer expects, and there's a tremendous amount of downside if you end up being the part of the supply chain that breaks, which creates a certain amount of pressure. One stat that we always are blown away by, we run this annual survey where we try to get freight quotes from large freight forwarders, and on average, even in 2019, it took an average of 3 days for a first-time importer, right, a mystery shopper, to get a price quote. And that kind of like brought up for me the question of, if I'm a logistics provider, I could work with a one-off importer who comes to my website and tries to get a freight quote. But from the platform perspective, do you feel like there's any specific advantages that a logistics provider, whether it's a carrier or a freight forwarder, can get when working directly with a platform company like Alibaba?
Yeah, I do think so. I think there's a couple advantages. One is simplicity, for starters. Alibaba has one of the largest networks of suppliers in the world, and millions of buyers. So I think working with a platform is a great way to tap into that market in one shot. You know, it's especially as we move towards long tail businesses that want to participate in global e-commerce. I think it's tough to do that on a one-to-one basis because it's a very, as you mentioned earlier, there's a cost associated with engaging at that level. So I think that's the first one, is simplicity. I think the other advantage, and I sort of alluded to, is being connected to a platform that has all the trade and supply chain data digitized already. Step one is conducting a trade between a buyer and a seller. And if we have that already digitized and ready for the supply chain, then it becomes much easier to get accurate data without rekeying, without error. And I think that's really the biggest promise here is when we partner, our platform for transactions with people who do a great job of freight forwarding, we're reducing delays and errors and customs holds and things like that. And that's really the goal. Like you mentioned, it's about being quiet in logistics, not taking the center stage. And so we are seeing our logistics being quieter when you have all the trade data up front, because then the commercial invoice is exactly what it should be. The bill of lading, everything is exactly the way you would want without, there's always errors, but minimizes errors.
Yeah, and I guess that comes back. It's the standardization thing, which is even if there isn't a global standard, at the very least, you're getting an influx of business from a platform that has its own standard, which means that it's a one-time connection rather than multiple connections. An interesting question that I actually haven't seen come up from Paula, who says that with standardization being such a key challenge, it's clear that addressing B2B processes is only part of the challenge. She's curious about the role of business to government flows and whether that might be a key differentiator to platforms, kind of working together with governments on standardization. Is that something that you feel might be a certain key?
Absolutely. I think that's the right way to focus on it, because the hardest piece of the puzzle to fit is often customs and the associated government agencies around them, and so that's tough to change. But when I was at Borderfree, one of the things we did was we just directly worked with CBP and other government agencies so that we could say, look, you have a problem, which is increasing e-commerce volume into the U.S., increased consignments, and a staff that maybe isn't equipped at all the ports to deal with that. And we're part of the industry. We'd like to help with that. And I think that's how freight forwarders and platforms like Alibaba, Freightos, we're in a good position to lean into that and work with government agencies and say, we have some ideas here. We want to help. We recognize you have a mandate to keep the country safe, keep things out that you don't want. So we want to be a good actor and actually help you with that from an industry perspective. And I've found that approach to be very helpful because, in the US, CBP actually wants that help. They actually want to hear from the industry. And so that's good for both of us. So I do think what you suggest that's the right strategy, is to lean in.
Yeah, and I just, to tag on to that, I could say one of the things that's been really interesting just seeing internally at Freightos, whether it's on the web cargo side or the Freightos side, is that we've been very permissive about sharing our APIs or our internal data standards, and that's always been very helpful. And I encourage other logistics technology companies out there to really follow what Jamin just suggested. Some of the largest freight forwarders or airlines in the world use our standards, but aren't even customers necessarily. And at the very least, it brings the industry towards an area where you potentially can work much easier with a partner, even if you're not working with them today. So let's shift over into some of the I guess, faster questions. Let me skip through this one because we kind of touched on it. Your favorite pizza topping?
Okay, it's a very important question. First of all, we got to clarify what pizza is, and for me, it's New York style. So,
I'm from Chicago, so I'm a deep dish kind of guy. But all right, you roll with it.
We can disagree on that, but there's pepperoni for me, and then there's everything else. So I'm a simple guy when it comes to pizza.
Gotcha. All right. B2B e-commerce versus B2C e-commerce. This is an interesting question that came in. Do you think there's any major operational difference between the two?
Yeah, this is really interesting. So we did a study recently on this. B2B is definitely different. I'll start with that. The differences are, people are trying to run a business, and so ultimately, I think there's some price elasticity in logistics, which is good news. But there's less tolerance, I think, for the uncertainty around B2B consignments. So what we find is our customers in the B2B world it matters a lot to them that they know the fully landed cost and when it's going to arrive, because a lot of them are planning their business, in advance. So the goods are on the water, and they know that, they bought the goods for, they thought, $5 a unit, but then it arrives and there's palletization fees, or the duties are twice what they thought, or whatever. And so now their profit model is totally messed up. A B2C user is, they've made that decision. There's not a change that's going to happen. All they care about is, get it to me as soon as possible. Mm-hmm. Another difference with B2B is that they are, it's not, Amazon actually does a good job of this too, but it's not just any day of the week. So B2C, get it to me Saturday, Sunday, whatever, as soon as possible. On the B2B side, many businesses don't have people at their dock every day of the week. Mm-hmm. So if you deliver it a day early and there's nobody there, that's actually bad. So,
yeah, it's just as bad as a day late, right?
But just one other comment on that. I do think there's a convergence between B2B and B2C here. And some of that's driven by, we're all B2C people, even when we are B2B, right? So we all tend to think about the B2C experience, even when we're running a business. And so I do think there's an expectation for transparent tracking and speed and reliability.
Yeah, and nowhere is it clearer than in this general target market of smaller buyers who come in with those expectations on a day-to-day basis, right? Where if you're getting your first shipment, you go in thinking it's going to be as easy as kind of getting a FedEx package. So agreed. All right, well, let's talk. We couldn't get through this without COVID. So do you feel like COVID is having a negative impact on innovation and technology investments?
I actually don't. I actually think it's having a positive impact in many ways, because, I think we've seen a secular trend during COVID of pushing people to accelerate their e-commerce agenda and to use more e-commerce platforms. And so I think what that means is logistics providers have had to, step up their game a little bit on innovation. At least I've seen this in the US, in order to win that increased market share. So, if domestic shipping has gone up, double in the last 4 months, then, you want your share of that growth as a logistics provider. And it's really going to come down to people who can provide a good e-commerce experience. So I do think it's an opportunity for a lot of people to capture that business. And I've seen some increase in innovation.
Yeah, and I just saw today that in the past 4 months, the U.S. has shifted kind of a decade worth of e-commerce change. And I think one of the most interesting parts about pandemic, and the word isn't here, but the fact that it's a global pandemic means that it's not just happening in one country. And most importantly, it's innovation that's really cross-border. So, I definitely agree on that side. Are you a business book guy? Favorite business book by any chance?
Yeah, I'm actually interesting. I have a number of favorites, but one of the ones that is a recent favorite of mine is called The Rational Optimist, which I don't know.
Matt Ridley? No, that's is that?
Yeah. Okay. I don't know if that's a business book or just a kind of a look at the world, but I like it because it's a data-driven book, which I love data, but it's also, as the title suggests, it shows that we're making progress on some things, and I think that's encouraging.
Mm-hmm. All right, great. Last question here. How can you help companies integrate platform-type services into their workflows? Many are stuck in TMS setups that limit flexibility.
Good. This is a big barrier for a lot of, for platform companies like Alibaba and logistics companies. Buyers are many times, as the question shows, they're stuck in a purchasing process that is very sticky to their TMS or their ERP system. One thing is, it's important to build plugins, or I should say, like punch outs, I guess. Companies are doing that, and that's a hard technology road. But once you get in there, I think most of the modern TMS systems allow for punch outs that enable you to expand into other types of logistics services. But this is probably one of the bigger challenges, right? Because you build 15 different punch outs for all the different ERPs and TMS systems. Mm-hmm. That's probably prohibitive for most people. So, and there are sort of intermediary services that allow logistics providers to pipe in their services and then get access to those customers using transportation management systems. Mm-hmm. So that's a complex answer, but I think the short version is TMS systems aren't going away. Like that's something that's going to live for quite a while, and we have to find ways as providers to get into that flow and not hope that they're going to just change behavior overnight.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Well, Jamin, this was fascinating, and I just really want to thank you for taking the time and sharing some of your insights with us here today.
My pleasure. Good to talk with you guys.
Awesome, thanks, and thank you for everybody who's listening in, who is staying so active with the chats. We'll be back in another 2 weeks. Our next guest is a guy who runs a supply chain innovation at Johnson & Johnson. So we're going from the very, very small side of the importer market all the way up to 9th largest in the world. But we'll be sending out the link later on next week. Jamin, once again, thank you so much, and everybody have a great day.